Hi everyone and welcome to the second video of the series Environmental Economics through the lens of microeconomic theory. My name is Thais Vilela and I'm an environmental economist. Today we will talk about externalities, which is an example of market failure, which occur when market outcomes do not lead to an efficient allocation of resources. So without further ado, let's get started. Here's what we'll cover today. What is the externalities are and how they create market failures, the distinction between private and social costs, why negative externalities lead to overuse and positive externalities to under-provision, some tools economists use to correct market failures, and a couple of examples, actually one example illustrating these concepts. So let's begin with the concept of externalities. An externality occurs when private decisions generate social impacts, costs, or benefits that falls on people who are not part of the initial private decision. Externalities can be negative or positive. Negative externalities are costs imposed on others. For example, a factory producing goods may pollute a nearby river. The factory considers all its own costs, labor, raw materials, energy, but the pollution affects fishermen, residents, and ecosystems in general. These costs are real, but they are not part of the factor's decision making. Positive externalities occurs when an action or decision creates additional benefits for others beyond the person or firm making the decision. These benefits spill over to society, but the decision maker does not receive any compensation for generating them. A classic example comes from conservation. Imagine a landowner who restores a degraded forest on her property. She values the trees for shade or aesthetics, but the restoration also improves water quality downstream, enhances biodiversity, and stores carbon. These broader benefits benefit many others and not only the landowner. So from an economic perspective, externalities create a gap between private incentives and social welfare. In other words, what is profitable for an individual, firm, or consumer may not be optimal for a society, like for society in general. At this point in the lecture, we need to distinguish two fundamental concepts: private costs and social costs. This distinction lies at the core of why externalities generate inefficiency. So let's begin with private marginal costs. These are the costs that a firm incurs when producing one additional unit of a good or service. They represent the costs that decision makers actually internalize when making choices. In contrast, the marginal social costs includes not only the private marginal cost, but also the marginal external damage, which is the cost imposed on others that the firms does not pay for. These external damages are real and measurable, but they are absent from the private decision-making process. And this difference is precisely what creates inefficiency. When private marginal costs are lower than social marginal costs, as shown in the graphic, the market outcome will involve overproduction. Indeed, as you can see in the graphic, the difference between Q1 and Q2 represents the additional quantity produced above the socially optimal level. In this case, the market generates more of the good or service than is desirable from society's perspective, because private decision makers are not facing the full cost, the full social cost, which in this example is indicated by P2. The same logic applies to situations of overconsumption. The only difference is that in that case, the inefficiency would be illustrated by adjusting the demand curve rather than the supply curve. Here we have an example of overconsumption, and this occurs because the private marginal benefit exceeds the social marginal benefit. In other words, an individual's consumption reduces social well-being. This is precisely what characterizes a negative externality. In contrast, if the situation were reversed, if the social marginal benefit were greater than the private marginal benefit, we would have a positive externality. In that case, an individual's consumption would generate additional benefits for others that are not reflected in the private decision-making process. And note here that we are we are looking at the demand rather than the supply because we're talking about consumption. So to summarize the market outcomes in the presence of externalities, we have the following. In a situation in which we have a negative production externality, the result will be an overproduction. A positive production externality will lead to underproduction. And similarly, a negative consumption externality will lead to overconsumption, while positive externality will lead to underconsumption. So the first two things you must consider when dealing with externality is: one, if it is associated with producing a good or consuming it, and two, whether it's positive or negative. Once you know these two things, then you know the outcome. Once the externality has been identified, the next step is to address it. The most common instruments are taxes, subsidies, and regulations. The purpose of these tools is to internalize the externality, ensuring that the prices and costs reflect not only the private dimension, but also the social one. It is important to note that these are government-based solutions. There are also private market-based solutions, but they typically require clearly defined property or ownership rights, an assumption that often does not hold in the context of natural resources. So now let's look at how these instruments could address or correct externalities. So let's return to our initial illustration. The graphic shows that the socially optimal level of production is Q2, yet because of the market failure, the market produces Q1. So to internalize the externality, the private marginal cost must be equal to the social marginal cost. And this is achieved by imposing a tax, in this case, in this example, equal to the marginal damage generated by the private decision. And what is the marginal damage? It is equal to the vertical difference between the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve. The challenge here, as many of you likely anticipate, is in measuring this marginal damage. But once it is known, the externality can in principle be fully corrected. So now let's move on to a real example that behaves very much like a textbook case, but with an interesting twist. So this study was published in 2015, and it investigates the introduction of a carbon tax in British Columbia, Canada. The goal of the policy was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from gasoline consumption, which, as we know, generates a negative externality. So on July 1st, 2008, the British Columbia government introduced a tax on each ton of CO2 emitted from burning gasoline. Economically, this tax was designed to make consumers and producers internalize the environmental damage associated with gasoline use. So in the table you see here, the first column shows the carbon tax, and the second column shows the retail price faced by consumers. As expected, when the tax is imposed, the final price of gasoline increases. So consumers face a higher price and reduce consumption by moving along the demand curve. However, what the authors find is even more interesting. So using econometric models, they show that gasoline demand in British Columbia fell more than the price increase alone would predict. In other words, there was an additional reduction in demand that cannot be explained just by the change in price. And this suggests that the carbon tax operated in two ways. One is like the expected price effect, higher prices, then you have like the movement along the demand curve, which lower or reduce the consumption. Then you have an additional behavioral effect. The tax itself acted as a signal, shifting the demand curve leftward. So instead of just discouraging gasoline use through a higher price, the tax also seems to have made consumers more aware of the environmental costs and more willing to reduce consumption on their own. So this is, again, a really interesting result, as it shows that environmental taxes can affect behavior not only through standard price incentives, but also by changing how people think about the good itself. So with that, I conclude today's lecture. To recap, we introduced the concept of externalities, which is an example of market failure, and investigated why they lead markets to allocate resources inefficiently. In environmental economics, externalities are common, and much of our work as economists focuses on finding ways to correct them. In this lecture, we looked primarily at government-led solutions such as taxes, subsidies, and regulations, which are like classic tools designed to internalize these external costs or benefits. But there is a growing interest in private-based solutions as well, including green labels, certification schemes, and other market-oriented mechanisms that influence producers and consumers' behavior without direct government intervention. I might create a video on these private approaches, but in our next video we'll shift gears and discuss another fundamental topic in environmental economics, which is public goods. So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching, and bye.